get it with an any-foam additive. You get it with raw materials to keep the lifter pumped up. So what we found is that extra 500 RPM that you would see on a pavement street track from, let's say, 65 to 7, or if your series allows it from 7 to 75, that's where the lifter is going flat, and you're not actually seeing the profile of the cam. So a lot of times, if you watch some of the better stock car engine builders, and in relation to or smarter operators that are choosing like a Redline 40 weight race oil, that those guys can put a car length on people at the end of the straightaway simply because their engines are actually showing the profile of the cam, where the guy they're racing, that the oil gave up in the lifter and that thing's out of steam. Hopefully that makes sense to the listeners, but where you see that the most is in the 24 hours of Daytona with what we had for the last couple of years in those Le Mans prototypes that ran LS engines, because perfect storm of power going down the end of straightaway. You can literally put a car length on guys based on the oil that you chose. And really the LS engine is a perfect example of it because it's a hydraulic roller.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense with the anti-foam stuff, because we're going to be running 64, 6500 in those motors all day long.
You're talking about the crate engines.
Yes, in the crates.
Now let's talk open engines.
Well, obviously the protection that you're going to get from open engines is where it's going to be more important, because most of the open engines are solid roller motors, or and a lot of guys actually have converted to hydraulic rollers because they're so reliable, and they just tired of working on stuff, and the valve train is so reliable now. But you're going to get that same principle out of an open engine, but more than anything, that most of the open engines wear out parts, where in these LS engines they're so reliable. But in open engines, you're going to wear stuff out, and that's where you're going to see the benefits of investing a little bit more. There's a couple of things here. Number one, a lot of the cheaper oils have lower levels of ZDDP. They don't have the 800 part per million that you would find in a street oil, but let's say they have 12 or 1600, where products like the Redline race oils have like 2200 parts per million of ZDDP. It's pretty unprecedented. And what that really does is it protects hard, hot, metal parts in the engine. So it's going to protect valve train, let's say, more than anything else in the engine. That's a pretty important part with these open engines, because you're pounding on parts that much harder.
And when you're saying ZDDP, you're referring to what we commonly refer to as zinc, correct?
Yeah, correct. The misnomer is zinc, but ZDDP or zinc diophosphate is the additive package that is kind of the go-to for a lot of people in the racing oil or in the motor oil world. If you run too much of it and you had any kind of catalytic converters or emissions equipment on a vehicle, you take a chance of clogging a cat. The other thing is that it's just that anytime you have to run too much of that stuff, is an imbalance in the engine. So, you can get there in a few different ways, but the better oils have a little bit more of it. You don't need a ton of it, but you need some more of it.
Awesome. Good answer. So we've got all kinds of questions coming in. Here's another one I'm going to hit you with. Does elevation affect the choice of the 30 or 40 weight like fuel?
No, not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
Doesn't have anything to do with it. That motor oil only knows what temperature it's being run at. So if you were to run a 40 weight at 280 degrees, it's going to get thin, because remember, a 40 weight is a 40 weight at 212 degrees or 100 C, right? 212 Fahrenheit.
Right.
A 30 weight is a 30 weight, or the viscosity, that lower viscosity of a 30 weight. So when you get it hotter than that, it's thinner than a 30 weight. And when you run it colder than that, it's thicker. So the mistake a lot of guys make is that when there's very cold conditions, they don't adapt to it, or they chose a 50 weight, which was wrong in the first place. And now they've got oil that's horribly thick at even 200 degrees. So if you can't see the oil temperature rise at a pretty quick pace, and then when it does finally get some temperature, it's screaming with temperature, that's how you know you've got too thick of a motor oil.
So in the case of like our season here starts off pretty cold or cooler, and as the summer progresses, it gets warmer, you're going to want to change your viscosity depending on the outside temperature.
And remember that you want to tape off these coolers. If you just mention a cooler that you need to be kind of modulating what that cooler sees and what it does. That great motor oil scenarios in race cars means that you'll get the oil up to temperature quicker, and a 1540 will get up to temperature quicker than a 040, right? There's no reason to be running 040s that are designed to run below freezing. You know, that's what you run in your pickup truck in Minnesota.
Right.
It's not what you want to run in a race car. So is now that if you would run a 1540 if you get it. Most of them are diesel oil, so you don't want to do that. But to that extent, you would basically run, you know, you would start taping off an oil cooler to try to get the thing up to temperature. Most of the time that we see in my 20 years in the lubricant business working with the best teams, guys ran too cold of an oil temperature, not too hot.
So where is the happy medium for oil temperature? Because I know there's a max temperature that you don't want to hit because then you lose your lubrication value or properties, excuse me.
Were you saying where would you collect that temperature, or what temperature would you like to see it run at?
What temperature would you like to see it running?
I mean, obviously, you'd choose 212. You'd want to pinpoint what you're running, but most of the time with most engines where you want them to free up, if you can get the oil to 220, 230 degrees, and if it can stay there as fast as you can get it there, and if you can keep it from going to 240, 250, which better oils like Redline are stable at those points. You can run them up to 280, no problem. But if you could get that thing to 220, 230, you're in pretty good shape there. One point I'd like to make for the listeners, too, is that when you see, the folks like Mobil talking about oil that runs at 400 degrees, our oil will go to 400. Well, guess what? The flipping main seal is going to fall out of the bottom of the engine at 330.
Right.
That's very true. That's
so
very
what's
true.
the point of that?
Right. It's totally unnecessary.
But to their point, they would do themselves a much better favor if they just said, hey, guys, we're made of PAO. Are we really anymore? But I'd like to hear them talk about that. But when you buy a better Motul or something like a Redline, not necessarily Royal Purple, they don't have the same quality of raw materials, and neither does the driven product. But when you buy like a Redline or a Motul, remember, I don't work for them anymore, so I'm just telling you the way it works, that you can then run up at a very high temperature, 260, 270, and have it hang on for some viscosity. If you tried to run one of these, cheapo $6 a quart Champion oils at 270 degrees, unless you picked a 50 weight and thought that you would still have protection if it fell down to the centistokes of a 30 weight, you'd be in big trouble. So just like I said, we're just trying to point out that when you invest in better stuff, you can abuse it a little more and still have some film strength left.
I like it. We got some really good questions coming in here. How much time do you have tonight, Cam?
I can give you a few more minutes, but how about this? You tell your listeners that, or I guess you guys are listening, that if you guys were really curious, we'd be hearing more about the transmissions and more about the differentials. All this hang up on motor oil is it's the way America works, but they're all hung up on motor oil. None of them ever look at the rod bearings to see what the actual wear in the engines are. And the real losses in the car, if you want to make a car work better, worry about what's in the transmission. Worry about what's in the gear, in the differential, especially in other disciplines of racing. In dirt racing, it's not so bad, but like working with Jimmy Owens, we've seen huge issues in the transmissions and how to fix them with using automatic transmission fluid rather than using gear oils, things like that. That's where the real questions, that's where the biggest problems I see for most dirt racers is misapplication of product.
Well, let's talk about those transmissions and those rear ends. I'm curious now.
Well, most of the guys that are choosing 75 140s could probably get these things to free up if they chose a better gear oil that was actually a 7590. One of the only places that we've ever really seen the need for a 75 140 gear oil was back in the day when we used to run World of Outlaws at a big mile like Syracuse, where where you guys, a lot of our listeners probably see the big block modifieds run there.
Right.
That those cars are more stable, but in a World of Outlaw car, in a quick change around someplace with such heavy loads that you could wear the ring and pinion out pretty quick. or you can wear gears out pretty quick in a quick change. Same thing goes in a dirt late model when they've run up there. That I can remember specifically with folks like Billy Moyer, where they would run our heavy shockproof from Redline, a product that's known for having huge viscosity and being able to cling better than any product in the world. Well, you'd wear the ring gear out because you really should have had a proper full, PAO and ester 75-140 to put up with that kind of abuse. Your typical IMCA modified that runs on a Saturday night, it just needs 75-90 gear oil of a very high quality. You almost never need to change it. Go buy a couple quarts of Redline 75-90, stick it in, you're good to go for probably, 5 or 6 races.
Bingo.
Mind blown.
See the stuff you can learn when you talk about people that know what they're talking about?
It makes sense, though. You start talking about wanting to put a high-quality oil in those ring and pinions, because that, in all honesty, the transmissions and the differentials are things that we just overlook. We're more so concerned about the engine.
You are right, and almost all of the questions that have come in tonight have been about the engine. The last one that just came in, I'm afraid to even ask now that we got away from the engines, but do you recommend a certain oil for break-in?
No, so here's the key with break-in, that the break-in oils that you see out there are nothing but super flippin' cheap gear oil or motor oils with a little bit of anti-wear added to it just to take care of wear in the parts. There's nothing special to the break-in oils that are out there necessarily. You can get to the exact same place with a 1030 quart of CarQuest oil and any of these engine break-in additives that give you the extra ZDDP and usually, a little bit of anti-foam to support that oil. The problem with using regular, let's say, synthetics in some race engines nowadays, it's not so bad because they seem to break in on their own, is remember, we're not trying to break in the cam. We're not trying to break in anything. All we're trying to do is help the piston rings get a seat, right, in the bore. And when you run slick oil, you don't get a chance to do that. So you specifically want to run oil that isn't slick. And a lot of the smarter engine builders that I talk to, they'll run a vacuum gauge. For example, they learn it in go-karting because it's a real simple example, right? We got a single cylinder. And as you're breaking this engine in, you're going to see this thing pulling more and more and more vacuum from initial startup. And when this thing tapers off in how much additional vacuum it pulls, your break-in's done, pull the oil out. So a lot of racers are using break-in oils longer than they really need to. But a lot of them didn't get the crosshatch right or, get the finish hone right. And it's a tough, and trust me, I don't blame them. I've screwed it up too. But the key is that you remember that all you're trying to do is give the rings a chance to seat. And as soon as that's over, you want to go to a good synthetic that's going to take care of the rest of the parts.
Okay. We just had another question come in, Cam, from a listener. What do you recommend to put in like a Saginaw 3-speed transmission?
Under a racing application.
In a racing application.
I couldn't hear you on that one. Repeat the question.
I'm sorry, bud.
Sorry.
What do you recommend for a transmission fluid for like a Saginaw racing transmission?
3-speed.
Like a 3-speed.
Yeah, so there's a couple of products that are out there. A lot of the times, those transmissions, believe it or not, will run on a super high-quality automatic transmission fluid, even in a manual transmission. Like Redline makes one called V4 ATF that's actually got it's the only one in the world with a PAO base stock. That the Saginaw doesn't necessarily have really close tolerances, so like a Tremec or some of these more modern transmissions. So with a Saginaw, you can run a little more viscosity. So a GL4 70W80 like Redline's MTL or the MT85 or even the MT90, you can run those oils without a problem. Remember that when you have synchros in the transmission, you do not want slipperiness. So that 75-90 with the friction modifier that works so great in the differential, that actually is what's causing your gear clash when you try to run it in a transmission. So remember GL5 for the extreme pressure additive in the differential, GL4 non-slippery in the transmission. There's a few folks out there that make them. Obviously, I'm proud of the ones that we made because we know they're the standard in the business. That Redline made a product called MTL that's one of the most popular in the world for something like that.
Okay, and then what about like a racing transmission like a Falcon or a Bryn or a Burt?
A lot of times those run on ATS, believe it or not. That